Prime Minister Mark Carney says resolving issues around aluminum tariffs could be key to securing a U.S. trade deal. He says the tariffs are hurting Americans more than Canadians.
Since the Americans put their tariffs in, their first tariffs on primary aluminum, the price of aluminum in the United States has gone up 58%. It's gone up by more of the tariff. Now, some of that's international prices, but most of that is pass-through of the tariff. So that's not a good situation for American companies, and it creates challenges, obviously, for companies like Rio Tinto.
The Prime Minister made those comments today at Rio Tinto, an aluminum facility in Quebec. He said Canada's trade negotiators are using that leverage to argue for a broader win-win deal for both countries. Louise Blais is Quebec's CUSMA review envoy. She joins us now. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. I want to start with how Prime Minister Mark Carney is brushing off Donald Trump's latest jab, calling Canadian leadership nasty. Given that Trump is hurling insults, what does that say to you about the state of affairs right now?
Hi, Katie. It's great to be with you. Look, in a way, it's probably a good sign. He always gets like this when we're getting closer. And it's not just with us. You'll recall when there were just a few hours or a few days before the European Union got their deal, all of a sudden, you know, everything was off and the European Union was difficult, all of this. So it's actually kind of a good sign. And the Prime Minister, I thought, handled it well today. He basically said, look, he says, yeah, we're demanding. We're not going to sell the house for nothing. You know, we want Canada to be respected. We want a deal that will work for us as well. And so I think that was the right answer. But I think it also demonstrates that we're finally now having real substantive conversation. And that is also a very positive sign.
I was going to say that sort of leads into what I want to chat about next is substantive conversations. Dominic LeBlanc has just had his second meeting in 2 weeks with his American counterpart, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. What does it say to you to get two meetings back to back?
Well, and it's more than two meetings back to back. Yes, Dominic LeBlanc has had a lot of time with Jamieson Greer, but I know that Janice Charest is meeting her counterpart on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis. She was there last week, she's there again this week, and there's a lot of very technical conversations that are taking place. So, no, I really, from everything I'm hearing directly from them and from what we've heard again from the Prime Minister today, these are finally real conversations that we hope will lead to an agreement. But I think the approach that the federal government has had is, of course, is to have something that wasn't just a one-off. They want to deal with a lot of issues all at once. That's a good strategy because you want to use all the levers we have, but at the same time, it makes the conversation harder because you're not wanting to leave anything on the table. Because often in negotiations, you leave the toughest things for last. And now we're under a tight deadline. If we only have 2 more weeks for the application of the 338 tariffs, that's really no time at all. And we're trying to deal with a lot of long-standing issues. But I get the impression that the American side is also at the table and is also motivated to get us somewhere. Where we'll end up, that will remain to be seen. But at least these are real conversations. And I think it's going to be difficult before it gets easier. And I think that's totally natural. I think that is what usually happens in negotiations.
Okay, I want to talk about the 338s and the sort of broader approach in just a moment. But you mentioned something in that answer about, hearing from them directly. Them, I'm assuming, is Minister LeBlanc and the chief negotiator, Ms. Charest. What are they telling you? What can you tell us about what you've been told?
Well, of course, there are things I cannot say because we've got to respect the fact that we need to keep our edge and we can't negotiate in public. And so I understand a Canadian's desire to know, and certainly I've spent the past several weeks with Quebec companies, and they're eager to know. They're having to make important decisions. The 338s are existential for a lot of companies. So I understand it's really difficult, but I'm not at liberty to share details. But I can say that the province really wants to be at the table, not directly with the Americans, but we want to be kept up to date on a real-time basis because there are things we can do, there are ways in which we can help, and there's also things that we need to defend. And so I'm understanding that the Dominic LeBlanc is meeting with his provincial counterparts this afternoon. That'll be a moment. But I think they'll have to keep letting us know hour by hour what is happening, because while we may not be able to share with your viewers directly, we as a government entity with some part of responsibility to our constituents, we should be informed. So, and in the past, in negotiations, and you'll recall, you've been around this for a long, long time, you had the industry reps in the other room. You know, when we were negotiating CUSMA and the FTA and CETA, we don't have any of this now. And so it is a little bit, there's a bit of a tension. I won't deny it, but I think we're getting there. There's a willingness to share, but I think we have an appetite for more, because we really need to be aware of what's going on to avoid collateral damage, because they are obviously, when things come up really quickly and demands change by the Americans, which we know that that's what happens, I think the better equipped our team is, the better the outcome will be.
So moving forward, we're less than 2 weeks before this latest tariff deadline. These are the 338 tariffs that Donald Trump has threatened, 50% on a wide range of Canadian goods. That's the one with the most immediate deadline. But at the same time, Canada has also been trying to get rid of those sectoral tariffs, the 232s, as we call them, on steel, aluminum, and related to the forestry industry, to wood products. And then there's the overall sort of desire to hammer out, you know, the path, the future for the CUSMA agreement. Those are three separate things, all sort of interrelated, all sort of interwoven. When Dominic LeBlanc and Janice Charette are going into these rooms, are they trying to get solutions to these individually, or is it one big broad, hey, let's get to a bigger agreement so we can solve this problem, let's eliminate the 50% tariffs, let's get rid of those steel and aluminum tariffs, let's find a pathway for CUSMA? Is it one big lump sum kind of thing, or are they individually going in trying to just, you know, fuse things off where they can?
Well, I think, you know, I think it's going to be a little bit of both. I think that in the short term, the 232s, I think we were close to a deal last fall. They've got a roadmap that they could start with on that. The 338s are, their potential impact is so great that I think that affords a little bit of an urgency. Those are brought in out of that 1930s law and Section 338 that says that we discriminated against them. And so there are things that we could do there to avoid or delay or put on pause that threat so we can get to the other files. I find it hard that we can deal with everything in the next 2 weeks. And I think that the renewal of USMCA is probably a longer term prospect. We heard that Jamieson Greer said that he had hoped that he would settle the renewal by the end of this year, both with Mexico and Canada. So in the short term, I think the 232s and 338s are important, but they deal with issues that are in CUSMA. So, you know, you can't completely separate them. There's a sequence in how you deal with these things, but really the urgency right now is on the 232s, and I want to say on the 338. So I think they're going to try to get as much done as possible, use the levers they have now, our team, but at the same time, I'd be very surprised if they can solve the entire renewal of USMCA within the next 2 weeks. Look how long it's taken with Mexico. The negotiations have been much more structured, but they take a long, long time. And there are more issues on the Mexican side. Their next round is in September. And I think the Americans are going to be cautious not to do us before them. And so I think there's going to be on USMCA renewal a bit of where I think we're going to have to be yet more patience. But the 338s and 232s, I'm assuming, are being dealt with together. And the Prime Minister will want to get a solution on those.
Louise Blais, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello.
Est-ce qu'un accord est possible d'ici le 19 août, M. Leblanc?
Canada's top trade officials in Washington today, Lead Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette, didn't say much before or after their meeting with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. But you know who wasn't so silent was President Donald Trump in Las Vegas last night, speaking about Canada.
We've been screwed by tariffs used against us for years by China, by Japan, by South Korea, by Germany, by everybody, by Canada. Canada's nasty. They are. They're nasty. People think Canada, they're nasty. I love the people, but they're nasty. nasty leadership.
Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked about those remarks today, and here's what he had to say.
Whatever adjective is used, yes, we're standing up for Canadian workers, for Canadian businesses, as we always have from the start. There are many things that the Americans want from Canada. They say they don't want them, but they do want them. It's energy, it's potash, it's critical minerals, it's aluminum. And for us, it's all connected. We're one country. We care about all these sectors. We're working hard.
And Carney is facing criticism from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre over his approach to U.S. trade talks.
I don't understand the strategy of making concession after concession after concession before even getting to the negotiating table. We're calling on him to take the leverage that he has not yet squandered, take it to the bargaining table, and get something in return for a change.
Time now for the Power Panel. Michelle Cadario was a Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. Gary Keller is a former Chief of Staff to Conservative ministers. And Shachi Kurl is President of the Angus Reid Institute. I want to start with you, Gary, because we had that clip there of Pierre Poilievre, the Leader of the Opposition, questioning the strategy that Mark Carney is taking in this moment. Tell us more about what it is, the sort of point he is trying to make there in terms of, the change or the shift that he'd like to see.
Well, I think it's only fair to ask questions. It's the job of the official opposition, the job of the leader of the official opposition to ask questions about what Canada's strategy just is. August 19th is coming up very, very shortly here. I don't expect that the government of Canada is going to make its trade policy and trade announcements before that date. But I do think that there is some transparency required. After all, we did see what happened when there was a lack of transparency around the deal around the Gordie Howe Bridge, and it wasn't exactly as advertised as what the Prime Minister was saying. And so I think what Mr. Poilievre is saying there too, and there is a list of things that he did try to address, that what the Digital Services Act, whether it's the Online Streaming Act, whether it's reciprocal tariffs. The Prime Minister says we will always stand up for Canadian workers. You can make the case that in fact in those three cases that isn't the case. And so there is a level of accountability that opposition parties, including the Leader of the Opposition, is trying to make there in terms of a case to Canadian voters about what the record of the Carney government actually is. And so I think we're going to see that in the coming days as well, as we discuss not just the nasty grams that the president launches against Canada. He also took a shot at Mexico yesterday. So I think in that respect, we just have to let that roll off our back and focus on the negotiations here, because that's par for the course for President Trump. But I think, like as Mr. Poilievre said, those are fair questions to ask about the concessions that Canada has made today and what we are getting in return for them.
Michelle, on the point that Gary is making there and what Mr. Poilievre said earlier, the fact that Canada has made a number of concessions and it's still in this moment, Canada's facing additional threats, and those tariffs that were in place previously, they have not gone away just yet. What do you make of the point that Mr. Poilievre is making right now?
Well, I think that Mr. Poilievre is trying to insert himself into the national conversation. There is really one overriding story, and Canadians are very focused in on and hoping for some kind of a success at the negotiating table, knowing that it's quite a strange and not normal times in terms of when you're dealing with the American administration. I think that it's probably worth pointing out that we're the only country besides China who actually did put in any kind of retaliatory measures, and most of those do remain on right now. Perhaps that's the root of the nastiness, not sure. But, I think that Gary did mention as well, it's not like Mr. Trump has a long vocabulary or a big list of names that he likes to call people. Nasty is a fairly normal one. He was grouping a whole bunch of countries together and tacked on Canada. Then careful to try and say that he likes Canadians anyways. I guess somewhere in the back of his brain, he probably thought, "Oh, I'm in Vegas. They could use having some Canadians actually come over the border and spend some money here that they're not doing right now." So, I think that it's a whole lot of talk outside of the negotiating table. What I'm encouraged about is that there seems to be some real discussion happening, some real exchange of ideas, creative ideas, paper being exchanged, and a concerted effort. This is, it's been a number of weeks now that they're in there. They're meeting every day, and they're talking on a whole wide range of issues. So, I think that it's hard when you're the opposition party, where you're trying to make your way into a national news story and there's not really room for you. And he took kind of the only avenue that might be available to him.
Shachi, when you take a look at the messaging that's happening, if we take a look at the broader Canada-U.S. dynamic right now, you've got Trump on one hand talking about how Canada is nasty, and then on the other hand, you've got, 2 weeks in a row of in-person talks between the top trade officials. How do you sort of square the messaging?
So much messaging. I mean, first of all, if I can just briefly talk about Mr. Poilievre.
Absolutely.
I'll be more generous than Michelle is in terms of this approach, but of course politics is the thing underpinning all of this. He's doing his job as the opposition leader. It is his job, objectively, as leader of the opposition, to point out things that he believes are speaking to a perceived accountability issue in terms of getting a deal done or giving away too much. I think these are reasonable criticisms. They, however, put him offside with 20% of his own base. When you've got 1 in 5 CPC voters, the last time we talked to them a couple of weeks ago on this issue and said, well, what should Canada do? Should we actually concede, make the concessions that the U.S. is asking for in order to get a deal? 17% of CPC voters say that's exactly what should be done. And about half of CPC voters say, actually, we should be playing softly, nicely with the U.S. as opposed to taking a harder line or imposing counter tariffs, either big ones or little ones. So, the broader message here is one that's more appealing to would-be Liberal voters, would-be Bloc voters. But in terms of how he squares it with a significant segment of his own voting base, I think it speaks to a broader conundrum that faces the Conservative Party and the Conservative voting movement, whether it's the Alberta referendum or this issue. It's the domestic stuff that's going to continue to confound him. Now, speaking of Ms. Charette and Minister LeBlanc and their continued efforts on trying to get a deal done before August 19th, look, they're trying to play 3D chess with a 26-month-old that has missed its banana and its nap. It's like it's not going to go so well. And I think we're seeing that in terms of the rhetoric that the president used in Vegas yesterday. And it's that kind of rhetoric that steals the resolve of Canadians. So it's not as though you're hearing Jamieson Greer or Donald Trump saying, hey, look, actually, 50% of Americans, and this is data that we have, we know this is true, think that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. from a trade perspective, that Canada represents either the most important trade relationship that the U.S. has or a very important relationship to the U.S. That's where half of Americans are. Now, half of Americans are not aware of what's going on. They're not really dialed into the tariffs and the actions against Canada, but they do view the Canada-U.S. trading relationship as really important. It's not as though that U.S. trade negotiators have said, we acknowledge the importance of this relationship. We would just like some things that we see to be more fair or more equitable from our point of view. We would like access to Canadian consumer and domestic markets for dairy or alcohol or other items. That's not what Canadians are internalizing or hearing, because they're not hearing it. What they're hearing is Canada is terrible, Canadian leadership is terrible. And it's like every time that gets said, we see a bump in the level of resolve that Canadians have, and we see a bump, rightly or wrongly, reasonably or unreasonably, for the Prime Minister in terms of his approval.
Gary, something that Shachi said in there is talking about, sort of how difficult it is for any opposition party in this moment to try and sort of thread the needle where you're holding the Prime Minister to account, but it's an issue where it's sort of a Team Canada approach, and Canadians are very motivated and galvanized, and a lot of very strong public sentiment is there. How difficult is it for Mr. Poilievre and those around him to try and sort of, toe toe that line where you're holding the government to account, asking the challenging questions and doing the things that an opposition leader does, but at the same time, it's an issue where so many Canadians have so many very passionate and strong feelings about?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And I think as an opposition leader, you've got to set out some clear territory. If you don't set out some clear territory, you don't define your position for yourself, others will do that to you. I think what Mr. Poilievre has been doing for some time, he's been pointing out the contradictions that the Prime Minister has been making in his public statements versus the reality of what the process of negotiations has been. You know, after all, in April of last year, it wasn't Mr. Poilievre who went to New York City and said, to make Canada strong, we need to make America great again. It was the Prime Minister who did that. And so I think these are some areas where Mr. Poilievre is trying to lay out some differences in terms of policy. Listen, the reality is the North American relationship will always remain a priority in terms of economic sovereignty, in terms of economic negotiation. And what I think that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more, and maybe CPC has piled on this a little bit, is that after the election and in the ensuing months, you know, it would have been nice to see the Prime Minister spend maybe less time in Washington, actually, and more time in places like Albany and Atlanta and Austin, Texas, and Sacramento and Lansing, the state capitals where states have real power. There's an ability both with Republicans and Democrats to build a bit of an alliance and to recognize the importance of that trade. The other thing that we are not having in this country in terms of the conversation is if we're pivoting away from a North American trading relationship and we are pivoting to other places, well, one of the places we've talked about pivoting towards and reorienting ourselves to is towards China. And we have not had that conversation in depth in this country, and the economic pratfalls that can have, the economic impacts that can have, things that impact not just economic development, but our supply chains, our digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, all these different issues, which I've seen the Conservatives, some of their critics also try to advance the cause. So I think there is room for Mr. Poilievre to make the case to Canadians about asking tough questions, demanding some transparency, and going from there.
Gary brings up sort of a fascinating point about the conversations we should be having in this country about whether it's shifting more toward Europe, whether it's shifting more toward China. But another conversation that sort of bubbled up a little bit, then kind of went away, is whether there needs to be a conversation about whether, you know, this signing an agreement with Donald Trump and the United States, even though it is the most powerful economy in the world, even though the Canadian economy is so intertwined with the American economy, but is, given the way the Trump administration has behaved in terms of not following the deals that are existing right now, is there space for a conversation about whether it's worth it to try to preserve this trade agreement or try to find another path? Michelle, do you think there's space in this country for a conversation like that?
Well, you know, I think I'll go back to what the Prime Minister has said from the very start of his leadership, really, is that he wants to get a deal, but he's not going to sign a bad deal for Canadians. And, you know, I think that for sure, one of his primary objectives has been to try and, you know, bring some more economic sovereignty to our country. And that does mean trying to shift some of the trade balance away from the United States towards other markets. But there's a deep entrenched reality that I think we all know. The North-South trade relationship is just so firmly established. The population that is just below the border is a market that you can't ignore. The transportation routes in this country are all built north-south, our supply lines, our supply chains, and it doesn't matter what widget or service that you actually have, it is completely and fundamentally integrated. And so I don't think that we can afford to ever ignore the United States. And that's unfortunate because, you know, it would be nice to have a lot more options. I think the Prime Minister is long-term looking at how do we develop more credibility and more options for different sectors, for different industries. What can it look like? And pursue everything that might be available. He's been certainly trying to work not just with Europe, but with places like Australia, the Middle East, India. You know, and I would suspect that that's going to absolutely continue, no matter what kind of deal gets signed or doesn't. But I think Canadians just know inherently that you can't ignore them. They're there. And we have to be able to try and establish the best relationship, the best trading relationship that we can. But that doesn't mean that we trust them implicitly, nor does it mean that we put all of our eggs in that basket anymore. And I think we've probably, as a country, learned our lesson collectively on that. And I would think that any future leader or future government, no matter what stripe, will certainly understand the risk inherent with ever kind of placing all the trust into the United States, even if it was there for us to take. So things have changed, but unfortunately, it's going to be generations before you could have any kind of a fundamental shift.
Shachi, what do we know about Canadians' attitudes when it comes to shifting sort of the economic dependence, or that sort of the way that supply chains are intertwined like that, shifting away from the U.S.? What do we know about Canadian attitudes around that?
There's a deep appetite to see more diversity, more diversification. And again, so much of that is driven by what's happened over the last 18 months and the things that have been said coming out of the White House vis-a-vis the relationship with Canada and indeed the trade relationship. So when the Prime Minister is on the road trying to make inroads, if you will, in places like India and China and Saudi, there is an appetite for, and other countries too, I'm not deliberately selecting those, there is an appetite for diversification. But of course, there's always the other pieces to that. Not all countries, in terms of Canadians' level of comfort in pursuing trade and business relationships, are created equally in the minds of Canadians. Certainly, they'd prefer to see more ties towards Europe, more dealings with NATO countries, willing to take some tentative steps around the ongoing, and it has existed for a long time, trade and agricultural sector relationships and exports between India and Canada, and indeed around China. But there are some countries that are definitely seen to be more off limits, and Canadians themselves are having to ask some tough questions around, well, we want to move away from depending on the United States from a business relationship point of view, but what happens when that does not square with our sense of principles and our morals, speaking to rule of law and human rights and the types of countries, having the privilege of the types of countries that they'd prefer to trade with, as opposed to, hey, we got to go out and beat the bushes in terms of trying to raise some income and money for our country via trade. So that's a big, significant part of it. And I think when we try to look at what the next 6 months or a year looks like, I think two things will happen. Canadians will start to ask the Carney government, hey, so all of that work that you've done running around the globe and trying to make some deals and signing memorandums of understanding, what has that actually resulted in? Do we have any magic stocks that have resulted from the planting of the beans, or should we start looking back to the U.S.? So I think it's a while before those conversations are ready to be had, but they're in the waiting, they're in the background.
All right, we're going to hold the conversation there because we have less than 30 seconds left, but I do want to bring up one thing before we take a quick break. Dominic LeBlanc has posted about his meetings today, just a little brief update, saying that our trade talks with the United States continue, saying that he had a constructive and detailed meeting with Ambassador Greer. This is a post he put on social media, saying our focus has been and will continue to be on striking a comprehensive deal that addresses sectoral tariffs and benefits Canadian workers. So that's the very, very brief and limited update that we get from the readout of that meeting. I want to thank the power panel today, Michelle Cadario, Gary Keller, and Shachi Curl. We will chat again next week.